This is video 2 in the Working with Model Data module, and we're talking about using data tables in Simio. And from the previous video, video 1, we talked about Model 7.1, an emergency department using a data table. And in this model, let me open up the model here, we can see that we have patients arriving to an emergency department, and the data table describes the patient type, priority, treatment time, and then the patient mix. And so in video 1 we talked about how to set the model up and how to work with the data table. In this video we'll be looking at three concepts. We'll be looking at relational tables, arrival tables, and data import-export. First up, let's talk about using an arrival table. An arrival table in Simio allows the user to specify times of arriving events. So if we look at our model now, go back to our source object, we can see that the arrival process is governed by this inner arrival time. So we have a stream of arrivals governed by this exponential distribution. With an arrival table, we use, instead of that mechanism, we use a table, and we specify time when an entity arrives. So we have a time, see if I can write that just a little bit better. Don't want to go there, time. We specify an arrival time for the entity. So step 1 of our process is to create the table that includes this column determining the arrival time. So let's go back to our model, and we'll go to our data, and what we want to do is just go to the ribbon and add a data table, and let's call our data table patient arrivals. And the first thing we need is to create a column that specifies the arrival time. And so I'm going to use a real property and name this arrival time. And so in our table we can go in and say the first entity maybe arrives at time 1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, so on. So we specify when the individual arrivals occur. Then we can go back to our facility view and specify in our source object, instead of using the random arrival process, I'm going to change the arrival mode to use the arrival table. And so note, when we do that, we get a message saying, okay, where's the arrival table property? And so we then go up and specify patient arrivals arrive time. And so now what's going to happen is when an arrival is, instead of having random arrivals, we will go to the arrival time table, and the source object will create an arrival at time 0.1, another arrival at 0.2, and so on. So that's relatively easy. Unfortunately, we're not finished because we haven't specified what actually arrives. So here at time 0.1, we need to know what entity arrives. And so how we have it currently set up is we have this reference assignment, so we need to get rid of that. So I'm going to get rid of these two reference assignments here, and then I'm going to reset this because we no longer have that table reference, so let's just delete that. And we need to determine what type of entities actually arrive. So in our data table, one option that I have would be to just use a standard object reference here and have an entity type. So I could specify at time 0.1 and just have an entity reference here. Unfortunately, if I did that, I would have to also replicate this priority and treatment time information. So every routine patient, I would duplicate this data of the priority and the treatment time. So a better alternative is to use what's called relational tables. And so I'm going to relate the patient arrival table with the patient data table, right? So what we need is the type, and this is what I want to refer to the patient data table. I'm going to refer to the patient data table, and what we're essentially doing is creating relational relational tables. So they have a defined relationship to one another, and that relationship is defined by a table key and a foreign key. And if you're familiar with relational database, this should sound very familiar. And so in our model, we can do that. I'm going to go back, and I need to do two things. I need to go to my patient data table and identify the column, the key. So I'm going to select patient type and click on set as key. And you can see we have the nice little key icon here indicating that the patient type column is the patient data table's key. Then I can go to patient arrivals, and I can specify I want to add a foreign key column. So I add my foreign key column. It's going to say, okay, what table key would you like to use? We only have one, the one we just defined, patient type. So we'll just grab that. And then to get rid of all my pesky errors, because I already have several rows, I'm going to go in and specify that our default value is routine. And so now we can go and specify the type of patient using this key. And so the foreign key is tied directly to the patient data table. And so notice now that we've defined this relationship, we now have the little plus icon here indicating that we can use the master detail view to show the relationship. And so this is telling us that the routine patient, the foreign key in the patient arrival table indicates that there are 3 routine patient arrivals at time point 1, 0.3, and 0.5. And then if we go to severe, we have 1 severe patient arrival and so on. So the master detail view allows me to look at the particular types of patients that will be arriving. And so if we then go back to our facility view, now we can specify the entity type using the relationship, because since the patient arrival table reference is set when the entity is created, the patient data table is related, we have direct access to the patient data table. So in the facility view, we can set the type using patient data patient type as we did before. But now we note again, we haven't manually set the reference. We never set the reference to the patient data table. The reference is inherited through the relationship between patient data and patient arrivals. Similarly, when we get to server 1, we don't need to adjust the ranking rule or the processing time, because again, we have that relationship, we have that reference set by the relationship. And so now when I run my model, we can see that we have the 5 arrivals that I've predefined at, arriving at 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and so on, and then we have no additional arrivals. So to summarize what we've done so far is we started with our initial model, and we want to modify the source so to use an arrival table. And so the arrival table allows us to specify particular times that entities arrive. So once we created the time column, we then need to specify what type of entity arrives, and so that's where we use the table relationships. We use relational tables. We created a relationship between the patient data table and the arrival table using a table key on the patient table and a foreign key on the arrival table. And note that this allows us to directly access data through that relationship. Also note that table relations can be nested to an arbitrary level. So while our current model only has 2 tables, that it has a single relationship, many models have multiple tables with multiple relationship values. In fact, one of the symbits that you should definitely have a look at, let me skip that for now, is the using relational tables symbit, which has 3 different tables with a somewhat more complex relationship than the one that we just demonstrated. We're not going to go over that video or that symbit in this video, but it's definitely worth your time to just make sure that you understand this this idea of relational tables. It's a very important concept. What we are going to do, the final thing that we're going to do in this video, is talk a little bit about data table import and export. And this is there are very flexible importing and exporting options in Simio that lets us bind data tables to a variety of sources. You can see here we have a database, a CSV file, Excel, the one-to-where MES, an XML transformation, and so on. And under the database type, again, we have several different options. We're just going to do a very simple process here. Let me see if I can get my model. And what I want to do is I want to bind my arrival table to an external data file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my patient arrivals and I'm going to export the table. We're going to see why we want to do this here in just a second. So I'm going to just export it. Let me just export it to my desktop here, and it creates my patient CSV file. So if I go look at my desktop, there's my patient arrivals CSV file, which was just created. So what I want to do now is I want to bind that table to my patient arrivals, or bind the patient arrivals table to that external data file. So I'm going to go to the bind to option, and I want to bind to a CSV file. Simio is going to ask which CSV file, and I'm just going to select the file that I just exported to. And so then it looks at the file, gives me the values, and I'm going to just use the default since Simio created this file. And I click OK, and the first thing that we see is all of our data disappeared. The second thing we see is we have this bind value here that tells us where the data is bound. So when I look at the binding options, we can see why the data disappeared. We have two options for binding. We have automatic binding, which is the default, and we have manual binding, which we can select. And so in automatic binding, the data will read the data, or Simio will read the data when the simulation starts. I'm going to just switch it to manual, and then I can the import becomes active, and I can simply import the data from the data. So now that I have the binding set up, I can go back and open the file in an external application, in this case Excel, and I can manipulate the data. So for this case, for this model, suppose I went in and just sort of increased my arrivals. So I just add some, if I can get my mouse to cooperate, there we go. Let's just add a whole bunch more down to, say, row 27, and then see if we can get these guys. If I could work my mouse today, this would be good. So I just grab that and then expand my selection accordingly. And so there we are. It just repeated the pattern that I already had. And now I'll just save the file. And I want to keep the format. There we go. Close Excel. I don't need to save that because I've already done it. And then I can go back in, and when I import the data, I get all the new data that I had in Excel. And so if I go back and run, of course, as we would expect, we're going to see all of those arrivals. And so you have tremendous flexibility here by binding the data to an external application. For our case of the emergency department, we could certainly see an opportunity to bind to whatever scheduling system the emergency department use, and we could automatically link those two applications together through data binding. So one final thing, now that we have this set up and we've demonstrated binding the data, in an emergency department like this, while we might have scheduled arrivals, we know that people don't always arrive on time. And so some people are going to arrive early, some people are going to arrive late, and some people are not going to show up at all. And so the arrival mode of using a table supports that variability on arrivals. Let me just mention this for a second. I'm not going to do much with it other than just mention that it's there. And so we can see that we have this category and properties called other arrival stream options. And the arrival stream options we're interested in is this arrival time deviation. So here I can put an expression for random deviations about the arrival time. So for example, I might have a uniform distribution between minus 15 minutes and plus 15 minutes. And what would happen is the arrival table the Simio would look at the arrival table for the nominal arrival time, and then it would sample a random variate to figure out the actual arrival time, which would deviate uniformly between 15 minutes early and 15 minutes late in the case I just gave. Similarly, the arrival no-show probability can be used to specify a probability that the arrival just doesn't occur. So in this case, it's the probability that a patient, say a patient who's supposed to arrive at point 8, just doesn't arrive. And so through that flexibility, we can do experimentation with deviation around a schedule. So again, in summary, what we did since we defined the relational table is we bound our arrival table to an external CSV file, and then we manipulated, or we set the binding options to manual so that we could manually import the data. We then modified the data in an external application and then read that in. So it's a very powerful feature that we should definitely exploit.